Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast, where we explore the rich history, culture, and traditions of the American South.
Welcome back to the Essential Southern Podcast, hosted by the Abbeville Institute. I'm your host, Brian McClanahan, and today we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky Resolutions. Now, if you want to know more about the Abbeville Institute, go to abbevilleinstitute.org. Click on the support tab if you want to become a donor. We do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like this podcast and everything else we do, please consider a donation, a tax-deductible donation to the full extent of the law. You can also sign up for our email list at abbevilleinstitute.org. Just give us the email where it says, get a free gift. You'll get a free ebook out of it, but you'll also get on our email list. And of course, you'll find out about all the great things we're doing at the Abbeville Institute. So let's talk about the Kentucky Resolutions. And why is this an essential Southern document? Well, of course, the Kentucky Resolutions, written in 1798 by Thomas Jefferson, became, in many ways, a continuation to Southerners of the spirit of 1776. In fact, you'd often hear them talk about the spirit of 76 and 98. So what they're referring to in 98? Well, of course, Jefferson's Kentucky Resolutions. You can also throw in Madison's Virginia Resolutions, but they were much more softer, I should say, in tone than Jefferson's Kentucky Resolutions. A little more tame than Jefferson. Jefferson took a much more aggressive view of the compact fact of the Constitution. I'm not going to talk about the entirety of the document, but I am going to give you a little bit of historical background. So we have in 1787 a Philadelphia Convention that drafts the United States Constitution. That Constitution does not come into effect until 1788. It's not operative until 9 states have ratified the document. Ultimately, all 13 of the original states would ratify the document. It would have taken until 1790 for that to happen. North Carolina did not ratify until 1789, and Rhode Island not till 1790. So 11 of the states ratified by 1788, Virginia being among them, and it was a late ratifier, meaning it did not ratify until June. The Constitution had already been put into effect, June of 1788. The Constitution had already been ratified by that point. 9 states had already ratified the document. It was thought that perhaps Virginia and New York would be the swing states. And in both states, you saw pretty substantial opposition to the document. In New York, in fact, the Constitution only passed by 3 votes. In Virginia, wasn't as close, but you certainly had a pretty substantial opposition to it, a formidable opposition, including people like Patrick Henry and George Mason. So the general consensus, though, that came out of that ratification process, North and South, was that the Constitution was a compact between states, and that the states, as parties to the compact, as Article 7 pointed out, it was the Constitution between the states ratifying the same, retained all the powers not delegated to the center. This ultimately led to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1791. But if you look at the proposals sent from the states to Madison, ultimately who trimmed them down, the first among them was what became the 10th Amendment. It was most important to the states. The states did not want to be taken advantage of by a central authority. And when you look at the preamble of the Bill of Rights, which says that this Bill of Rights is to prevent misconstruction. What is misconstruction? What does it actually mean? It means extreme centralization of power. Now, across the United States, this was generally accepted. It wasn't just the South that held on to this. Northerners were suspicious of central authority as well. People like Roger Sherman of Connecticut were certainly worried about the powers of the central government. In New York, with a 30-27 majority for the proponents of the document, you had a number of individuals who were suspicious of central power. People like John Lansing and Mellington Smith. These were important individuals in that ratification process. They were ultimately defeated because they were promised that the central government would have clearly defined powers, meaning that you would have a central authority that handled commerce and defense only. That was it. The rest of the powers were held by the states. Well, after the general government goes into effect and we start seeing the Federalist Party, the Federalist faction, wasn't a political party like we think about today, but the Federalist faction, begin taking power to the center, arrogating power to the center that wasn't there, at least how people thought. Some of these people who supported the Constitution began to waver, and they actually joined the other faction, the Democratic Republicans. That's Thomas Jefferson's faction. So George Washington, president for 2 terms, wasn't really, he was a Federalist, but not a Federalist in the way that we think about the faction. Washington was much more interested in being a glue that held the Federal Republic together. He certainly sided more with the Federalist faction than he did with the other side, but he certainly held sympathy for the other side. You can't say that about John Adams, who became president elected in 1796, assumed office in 1797, and at that point the Federalists really put the screws to the other faction. In fact, in 1798, they passed a series of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts that were overtly intended, to suppress free elections in America. They were intended to suppress free speech. Now, we had already had the Bill of Rights ratified and added to the Constitution. The sedition law was an attempt to suppress free speech. The alien laws were seen as problematic because they were essentially saying that we had a national character to our immigration policy. Now, you can make a case that we have that based on one part of the Constitution, and most importantly, the clause that allows the United States government to prohibit the importation of such people. Right? So this was directed at slavery, but it was also thought that this could create a federal immigration policy. Jefferson disagreed. Madison disagreed, and thought this was supposed to be left up to the states. In fact, he argues that quite extensively in the Kentucky resolutions. But more than anything, Jefferson saw this as a threat to state powers and, of course, the liberties of a free people. That the federal government had gone beyond its constituted authority, and how do you check that power? That was the real question in 1798. Should they rely on the Supreme Court? Well, during the ratification process, this was discussed. Patrick Henry, in fact, in Virginia, said that he hoped the Supreme Court would be some kind of backdrop, some type of backstop for liberty in America, that the Supreme Court would serve to check unconstitutional power. But during the ratification process, this was brought up. What happens if the Congress passes a law, an unconstitutional law? The president signs it, and the Supreme Court declares it constitutional. What happens? Well, even in the North, it was said that the states would be powerful enough to check unconstitutional power. The check became the issue. The Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, located primarily in the South, but not exclusively in the South. There were Democratic Republicans all over the United States. But the Jeffersonians, which is certainly a main component of the Southern tradition, you can't get away from that. They thought that the states offered another obstacle, a hedge, so to speak, between unconstituted federal power and the people. We know the Constitution operated directly on the people, but Jefferson and others viewed the states as a way to block that. So beginning in 1798, the southern states become the most conspicuous advocates of what's known as nullification or state interposition. This is not a new idea, though. In fact, the states themselves have used it during the run-up to the American War for Independence. You had instances in New England, for example, where a nullification was used in opposition to the Stamp Act. So this idea of using the constitutional structure as a hedge was nothing new. It was an American principle that the South held on to longer and more vociferously than any other part of the United States. Now, it didn't mean the North didn't use this either. They eventually would use it in the 19th century against what they considered to be an unconstitutional fugitive slave law. And in fact, South Carolina and other states complained about that when you got to 1860 because they considered that to be a constituted law. The fugitive slave clause is in the Constitution, so they thought this was an illegal use of nullification. But here, 1798, you have a clearly unconstitutional Sedition Act. In their mind, you have clearly unconstitutional Alien Acts. And so the only recourse is to use the states themselves, Kentucky and Virginia, to block those legislative positions. Now, for years, historians said that Virginia and Kentucky were basically on their own, that no one would support them in this process. But there's been a lot of work done on this in the last 20 years, really the last 10 years. And the general consensus now is that other states were willing to join in with Virginia and Kentucky in resisting federal power. And this is often pointed to, well, New England rejected it. This is true. But there were other states who were certainly willing to side with Virginia and Kentucky should the general government try to pursue force against those states and force them to comply with the provisions of the Alien Sedition Act. So this became a big issue, of course, in the 1800 election. It's one of the primary reasons John Adams lost in 1800. It's one of the primary reasons the Republicans assumed power for the next, for up through the 1850s. There were periods of time where you had national Republicans, but really the Jeffersonians became ascendant. The Federalists would have some reprieve from the Jeffersonians during the John Quincy Adams administration, but Quincy Adams always considered himself to be a national Republican, very much in line with the Jeffersonians, but certainly in favor of things like protective tariffs and internal improvements. And even James Madison himself teetered on that by the time he became president in the 18-teens. So that's a whole other issue. But this principle of 98, when you go back and you look at what Southerners were saying, when you get to 1832 and South Carolina nullification, before that point, there was a discussion of the principles of 76 and 98, particularly among Virginians and the old Republicans and the tertium quids and people like that. These were the purists in Virginia. These were the people, the Richmond junto, that firmly believed that the general government had specifically expressly delegated or expressly enumerated powers, and those powers could not be abridged by the center, and the states had full authority to block them. That became a primary principle of the Southern tradition, and it's why we're going to talk about at least a couple of paragraphs in the Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions today. So let's start with this first resolution. Number 1, resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. That's a pretty bold statement. The several states composing the United States of America. So right from the beginning, Jefferson has said this is a federal republic. We have several states composing a union of states. This is not a central authority. Now, we can have some question about whether we created a union of states or a government. Lincoln would call it a government, but certainly Washington would call it a government. There were these distinctions to be made. But what do we have with the United States? It's a union of states. They're not united, though, on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. But that, by a compact, the compact fact, other thing about the Southern tradition, you often hear there's a compact fact. Southerners believed it was a compact theory. Southerners believed it was a compact fact. It wasn't a theory, it's a fact. This is what we had. We had a compact fact. That became part of the Southern tradition. Not a theory, a fact. But that by a compact under the style and title of a Constitution for the United States and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes. So the Constitution creates a general government for special purposes. This is the compact. The Constitution is the compact. What it does is create a government. So that's what the Constitution does. For special purposes. These states acting in concert create something for special purposes. Delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government. Well, this is how the Constitution was directly sold to the states. I mean, this is not something unusual to be said. Northerners and Southerners sold the Constitution to the states in this way. So it has certain definite powers, right? That will be commerce and defense. Each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government. So there are certain things the general government can do, and everything else is left to the states. You know what's not found in that? The ability for the general government to prohibit free speech. The ability for the general government to regulate immigration in a way that would be alien to the state's wishes on that particular issue. Now, this is a hot-button topic today. Can the states regulate immigration themselves? The general government has said no, But when you go back and look at Jefferson, and you look at the Southern tradition in this way, the states could regulate immigration themselves. They could have it be much more open or much more restrictive. But even here, Jefferson's pointing out, eventually will point out, that the Bill of Rights would certainly infringe upon the ability for the general government to pass this kind of legislation. But again, Adams has signed it into law. Where's the check? Supreme Court will probably uphold it. Where is the check? And that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, meaning unconstitutional powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. So whenever the general government passes unconstitutional powers, unconstitutional laws, those acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. An unconstitutional law, in other words, is no law. That is certainly part of the Southern tradition. That to this compact, each state is ceded as a state. If you say that a state acceded as a state, it can therefore secede as a state. See, this is why people say, well, the nullification process is just a precursor to secession. And South Carolina certainly made that part of it in 1832. But in their mind, both South Carolina and Jefferson's mind, doing this actually saved the Union. This was a Unionist message. Nullification was there to preserve the Union, not to destroy it. But Jefferson's position that you accede as a state, therefore you can secede as a state, is a logical conclusion. And South Carolina would take that to its logical conclusion, and you would have some talk about these things leading into the late 18th, early 19th century. And as an integral party, it's co-states forming as to itself the other party. So when you accede as a state, you're an integral party. It's co-states forming as to itself the other party. So the states are parties to the compact, is what he's saying there. We have a compact of parties, which would be states, and therefore the states, as he's going to say, can be judges of the powers of the general government. That the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. So if the general government has all the power to say what is constitutional and not, that creates a very dangerous situation where it can determine what its own powers are, right? Well, it has this power or that power. That makes it very dangerous. There has to be some other referee in Jefferson's mind. And that referee would be the states. Again, this became an integral part of the Southern tradition. But that, as in all other cases of compact among powers having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well as infractions as the mode and measure of redress. So Jefferson's position in saying there's no common judge, the common critique of this, well, you do have a common judge. You have the Supreme Court. That's the common judge. Jefferson's position on that was pretty simple. The Supreme Court was not the final arbiter of all constitutional decisions, particularly when it came to state laws. Right? That was a whole other issue. This is dealing with federal laws. It's a different kind of thing. But when it came to state laws, that was another problem. So here we have a lot going on. There's a tremendous amount of stuff happening in this one paragraph that you have to understand. So again, the principle of 98. The states accede to the Constitution. It's a compact between states. States can determine, they can judge for themselves whether a law is constitutional or not. That they weren't in a union of unlimited submission to a general government. The Constitution did create a government for specific enumerated purposes. When they go beyond that, the states can then judge if they've breached the compact. A lot going on here. But that becomes really important when you talk about the principles of 98. It's a huge deal. Number 2 resolution. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole document. But number 2 resolution. Resolved that the Constitution of the United States, having delegated to Congress a power to punish treason, counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States, piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the laws of nations, and no other crimes whatsoever. That's a really important point. There are only specific crimes that the United States government can prosecute. And he lists them. These are the only things the United States government has the ability to prosecute criminal transgressions. So treason, counterfeiting, and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the laws of nations. That's it. You look at the entire Federal Register of Crimes, it goes well beyond this. Those are the only things the federal government can call crimes. All the rest has to be left up to the states. Every other type of crime is actually a state crime, not a federal crime. So you create all these multiple layers of crimes, right? And this is where people are often hit 4 and 5 times, it seems like, for the same type of crime. You're prosecuted at the state level, then you're prosecuted at the federal level. I mean, it becomes a real mess. That's because, as in Jefferson's mind, all those things would be unconstitutional because the United States government only has the ability to punish certain crimes. That's it. And it being true as a general principle, and one of the amendments of the Constitution having also declared, the powers not delegated to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Therefore, the Act of Congress passed on the 14th day of July, 1798, an act entitled an act in addition to the act entitled an act for the punishment of certain crimes against the United States, as also the act passed by them on the day of June 1798, entitled an act to punish frauds committed on the Bank of the United States, and all other acts which assume to create, define, or punish crimes other than those so enumerated in the Constitution are altogether void and of no force. That the power to create, define, and punish such other crimes is reserved and of right appertains solely and exclusively to the respective states, each within its own territory. This is a really strong statement. Something, again, that we don't often think about in modern society when we have multiple layers of federal crimes. Jefferson would say that all those things are unconstitutional. All of it. All of it. Not one part of it would be constitutional. Because, again, under a strict construction, this is often called strict construction, and Jefferson had already gone down that path with Washington in opposing the Bank of the United States. Washington sided with Hamilton, who enlarged the necessary and proper clause. And, of course, the Supreme Court would ultimately do it in 1819 in McCulloch v. Maryland. But what happens, of course, is Washington says, all right, we've got Hamilton's defense of the bank, and the bank, we can read between the lines and find the constitutionality of this. And Jefferson would say, you can't do that. There are only things, if it doesn't, the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, you can't do it. So what he's arguing against here in 1798 is, again, loose construction. And he's relying on, of course, the 10th Amendment as a defense of that. Federal laws that create crimes are unconstitutional, according to the 10th Amendment and according to Thomas Jefferson. Number 3, that it is true as a general principle and is also expressly declared by one of the amendments of the Constitution that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, and that no power over the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, or freedom of the press being delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or all lawful powers respecting the same, did of right remain and were reserved to the states or to the people. This is a really interesting point. He's going to bring in the First Amendment later in this paragraph. But one of the arguments against a Bill of Rights was that by enumerating these powers out, you're actually admitting that there are other powers in the Constitution that aren't there, that were not written in. They're implied, right? They're not expressly listed, but they're implied, and that's okay. These things were all okay. So the argument against the Bill of Rights is actually a really interesting argument, and I think strongly enforces the idea that we had a general government of limited powers. Bill of Rights may, in fact, have messed some things up a little bit, but Jefferson's relying on the 10th Amendment here. And thus was manifested their determination to retain to themselves the right of judging how far the licentiousness of speech and of the press may be abridged without lessening their useful freedom, and how far those abuses which cannot be separated from their use should be tolerated, rather than the use be destroyed. And thus also they guarded against all abridgment by the United States of the freedom of religious opinions and exercises, and retained in themselves the right of protecting the same, as this state, by a law passed on the general demands of its citizens that already protected them from all human restraint or interference. And that in addition to this general principle and express declaration, another and more special provision has even been made by one of the amendments of the Constitution, which expressly declares that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now, notice what Jefferson did. He didn't start with a First Amendment defense of this. He started with a 10th Amendment defense. We don't have in the Constitution the authority for the Congress to do anything to suppress free speech or free religion. That's a 10th Amendment issue. But we also have this First Amendment that makes that even more clear that you can't do this. So the 10th Amendment still is paramount to the First. That's important to get out of this. The principle of 98 has always been the 10th Amendment is the most important amendment to the Bill of Rights. All the other stuff really doesn't matter because the 10th Amendment would knock all these things down anyways. You could have just had that amendment and all the other things would have been covered in it. There's nothing else that would have been able to be done. In fact, that might be the strongest construction of the Constitution possible. They just put that in there. It would have limited the power of the general government to only those things in Article 1, Section 8. That is the spirit of 98. It's something the South talked about, not just in the 18th century, the 19th century, but even in the 20th century. This tradition is part and parcel of the Southern tradition. Now, again, it wasn't exclusively Southern. Northerners would use it too, but they started backing off and started accepting a much more quote-unquote nationalist position because it suited their needs in the 19th century. Nationalism became synonymous with Northern sectionalism, and that's kind of how we viewed it since this point, that the South was being this thorn in the side of good government, when in reality, the whole thing should have been flipped on its head. It was the North that was being aggressive and advocating positions that were not in the Constitution, and the South was simply defending the original Federal Republic. That's also part of why this is an essential part of the Southern tradition and an essential Southern podcast. He says, thereby guarding in the same sentence and under the same words the freedom of religion, of speech, and of the press, insomuch that whenever violated either, throws down the sanctuary which covers the others, and that libels, falsehood, and defamation, equally with heresy and false religion, are withheld from the cognizance of federal tribunals. Therefore, the Act of Congress of the United States passed on the 14th day of July, 1798, entitled An Act in addition to the Act entitled An Act for the Punishment of Certain Crimes against the United States, which does abridge the freedom of the press, is not law, but is altogether void and of no force. And again, it would be void of no force, you could say, just in the state of Kentucky. You could say it's beyond that. There was some discussion about how there had to be a referee in this document, how you had to come up with some type of referee, some type of outside committee to really determine whether these things were constitutional or not. In other words, a committee of states. That's something that was never done. This is the Calhounian position of the concurrent majority, something we will talk about eventually on this Essential Southern podcast. But certainly the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, the Kentucky resolution more importantly, and I'm going to stop with that third part. You can read more of it. You can get the Kentucky resolutions online and read them for yourselves. But this is one of those essential Southern documents. It's one of the essential Southern traditions of the spirit and principle of 98. It is important for our understanding of American government. It's important for our understanding of the U.S. Constitution. Without it, the Constitution is something entirely different. Without understanding the compact fact of the Constitution, you have this belief taught in most schools that we created a national government with complete control over its own powers. That was never the case, never intended to be the case. And as Jefferson, I think, correctly points out in this document, we had a compact between states, the compact fact, and that there was the states as the fourth leg of the general government. It was the fourth leg of the stool. Very important to get. All right. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Essential Southern Podcast. I'll see you next time for the next one.